Hello, thank you for being here. I truly appreciate your attention. As promised, I want to talk about neoliberalism, what it means, a little bit of its history, and in the context of education, how it is impacting our lives and everybody else's lives on a global scale. And so, to begin with, I want to preface this talk by uh, saying something in defense of theory. There are lots of people outside the academy that think that theories belong to books and school libraries and people's bookshelves at their homes and studies and conferences and that sort of thing. And they don't really have anything to do with pragmatism that people experience on the streets in real life and so on. I beg to differ with that notion. I think good theory is always a right tool to use to understand the material conditions at hand and the future conceptual conditions. That we could use theory as tools to not only understand, but also gain critical perspective and then take the next step of taking action, of changing things, the conditions, for betterment of humanity at large. So good theories will do that. And I think that talking about neoliberalism in theoretical terms is extremely helpful for us to gain a deeper understanding of what's happening with this unfeathered, unchecked, and uncritically challenged corporate capitalism that has permeated almost every facet of our lives around the globe. So point of departure is going to be late 1970s. But neoliberalism has its roots going back to the Age of Enlightenment. And particularly, we can look at the philosophy of John Locke and his work, how it has impacted and shaped the way in which our government of liberalism has formed in the United States. But for the sake of understanding and brevity, I'll start with the 1970s, in particular, 1978. I'll start with China first. And the history of neoliberalism, of course, has been talked about and written about. And one of the best books about it is done by David Harvey, um, A Brief History of Neoliberalism. Even though he wrote this in 2005, to this day, it's relevant and a good primer for some, and an introduction, if you will, for others to kind of understand the genealogy of neoliberalism. So I'll touch on a few things, but if you want to go deeper at this, David Harvey's book is an excellent start. So in 1978, China took a revolutionary turn with its society. The person that should get the credit for leadership of such change is Deng Xiaoping. We'll just refer to him as Deng, who took the really momentous steps toward liberalization of a communist-ruled economy that was, central and non-capitalistic, and, and turned that state into a capitalistic, gigantic enterprise. Now we're talking about the world's largest population, fifth of one of the largest populations in the world. The fifth of the world's population resides in China. So Deng defined and transformed China in a very short time, historically speaking, in about 2 decades. He turned a backwater nation that was on the brink of being a third world nation into essentially what it is today, which is a superpower, uh, and using capitalistic models of business and turning China gradually, after 20 years now, the new leaders of China have, with Xi and others, have turned China not only into the world's manufacturer, but also the leading nation in terms of artificial intelligence and other tech industries. And militaristically speaking as well, they are a superpower. And they also did something that is interesting and controversial. They exploited labor, not only in their own country, but in other countries where they go and invest and use local force to do their work, and generated within their own nation a very robust and strong and supportive middle class, which you could say is the largest, richest middle class in the world. Uh, and that continues to be the case. But they're paying big prices as a result of this success. One is the continuous oppression of the labor force. We're talking about human beings in China. Also, the devastating ill effects of this overboard capitalism, which has yielded this terrible environmental crises that is in China, but then by extension around the world. So in 1978, this is what started, and today, of course, in 21st century, here they are. Now, what happened at the other side of the Pacific? There was a figure by the name of Paul Volcker, who is well known today, but at the time when he took over the US Federal Reserve, which was in 1979, actually, he was a relatively unknown figure, but he had some radical ideas. He decided to lower the interest rate and basically liberate money, and tackle the issues of unemployment. Then across the Atlantic, we have Margaret Thatcher, who in between 1970 and 1974 was the Secretary of Education in the UK, but by 1979, prior to Volcker's appointment in May, she became the Prime Minister of Britain. And she had a mandate to bust the trade unions, mitigate and reduce and eventually eliminate the labor power, and start developing this new ideology of individualism and non-social policies. In other words, measures of austerity with social programs, and privatization of many industries and services that traditionally governments were providing. Then coming back to the US in 1980, we had Mr. Ronald Reagan, this charming, former actor, former governor of California, who had a kind of personality that could be very attractive to many people on either side of the aisle, becoming president of the United States. So he used this charisma to be the leader of the type of ideology that Margaret Thatcher was championing in the UK. So together they became this dual-headed monster of new ways of forming society and nation building. The policies that Reagan championed were policies to curb power of labor, deregulate industry, and liberate the powers of finance. Today, the banks and other financial giants pretty much run this system that self-regulates in terms of where to spend the money, how much money to be spent, what sort of investments, interest rates, imposing their will onto governments. And of course, in 2008, we remember that the fruits of neoliberalism were the gigantic financial disaster. And what did the government do? They bailed out the banks and sort of screwed the people. Those who lost their homes, who lost their jobs, who lost their pensions, 401k, including many universities that had kind of bought into this financial game of putting the endowments and the pensions and the 401ks into big financial investments, big risky things that for a while it was coming with big rewards, but then all of a sudden things started to disappear almost overnight. So those are the ill effects. So China looks at Japan, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Singapore, and South Korea, and how they're mobilizing the market socialism instead of central planning, and decided, well, we're going to be the king of the hill in this region. So you've got China, you got the United States, and you have the UK. And of course, the European Union was the next region that was going to be, because it's mostly capitalistic, was going to be affected and changed by this approach. So what did Volcker, as the intellectual force behind this new form of governing, which did away with the Keynesian system of economy and then sort of decided to adopt the market fundamentalism of neoliberalism. Um, so what did they do? They brought to the table this idea that society should be shaped by free market economy, should be deregulated, right? Everything should be deregulated. In other words, the market should decide, the private sector should decide how to go about creating policies for all people, how to go about providing um, goods and services to human beings within their society. And what did this do? This turned the market into an ethics, a system of ethics in and of itself. In other words, if the market dictates that we keep minimum wage at its lowest level and people are still kind of like participating in the system, then so be it. And we're seeing that this has played out in the United States um, devastatingly, essentially. People are living with starving wages, but they had a solution to this problem that eventually people would go on the streets and want to change, and heads must roll. So they figured, well, let's liberate families. Let's provide low paying freedom ensuing jobs for everyone. Let's put the teenagers to work. Let's have women and men who are the heads of households to just both work, and let's have daycare services. Let's have service industry to become the at the top of the hierarchy of labor force, rather than the old ways of doing um, manufacturing and other forms of economic stimuli in the country. So you may be asking the question, what does neoliberalism have to do with classical liberalism? And why does it matter? Well, neoliberalism uses the language of liberalism, as I was talking about initially about the 18th century, John Locke, and moving forward, the notion of freedom of perspective, freedom of movement, and all these notions of freedom, in the United States and pretty much in North America, the word freedom is used for many, many, many things. Freedom to buy the biggest TV you want, the freedom to have the biggest dog, the freedom to own things, the freedom to do this or that. But do you have freedom to choose the way that you want to live with your neighbors? There is the illusion of that in the language that is used to talk about these notions of freedom. It's very attractive, but in practice, we're seeing something drastically and dialectically diametrically opposed to that language. So basically, the promise of the free market ideology is that policies are supposed to allow people an equal chance into the marketplace um, under the umbrella of neoliberalism. So, in other words, everyone having an equal chance to make it in school, in work, and any other societal enterprise. Sounds good, right? Having a chance. This is the whole business of equity, right? Right now, equity is one of those sexy words that is used in higher education as well as K through 12. Well, people are talking about people having access to education, and this is what we need to do. Everyone needs to have access. The underserved need to be brought to the table, and all these things that they talk about, right? Of course, it's beautiful talk, but what happens in action? Which brings us to this notion of the meaning of education, right? And this is the kind of discourse that we have at hand here, talking about philosophy, history, and practice of education. So We can take the American public education system as an example of how uh, big business interests have infiltrated it as a collective system. So, um, a little bit of a history. After World War II, when the United States was the emerging superpower in the world, with the victory of uh, the Allies. On the one hand, you had the Soviet Union with the Iron Curtain and so on. The Cold War had ensued, and there was problems of imperialism and all the rest of it. But something else happened in the United States. The United States became very rapidly, very quickly, became uh, the model for education around the world, particularly in higher ed. Uh, with the GI Bill and other opportunities that were available, and the freedom of people to go to college, because prior to that, going to college was one of those things that you'd have the privilege, and the privileged class had access to college, and it wasn't necessarily the kind of thing that people needed to do to get good jobs. The idea of education was about life of the mind, learning about the value of humanities, philosophy, history, the arts, appreciating the human condition through the lens of the artistic, philosophical, moral, and all the rest of it. That should be the idea of freedom. I mean, uh, Maxine Green's book, The Dialectic of Freedom, talks about this. She wrote this in the 1980s, but to this day, it's absolutely relevant. Um, Talks about the idea of education for freedom, which is essentially a moral project. So the United States in post World War II um, created and fostered such environment for education. And it was wonderful. People having finally the working class, the so-called middle class, along with the working class at that time. When you said working class, it was essentially middle class, and they had access to learning things about the world, learning things about various disciplines and ideas, and thinking, and critical thinking was fostered. And so people were starting to get educated, right? And it was a system that was very successful, and it created much innovation, not only in industries but also in the arts and systems of thinking and all the rest of it. But after the inception of privatization of education, we got into trouble, right? And this started at the late 1970s, and it just moved forward in the 80s and the 90s with the Clinton administration, sort of like um, uh, allowing deregulation not only of the communication systems with telephone systems and the media and all the rest of it, but also deregulating industries that could infiltrate schools and sort of take over with their software systems, management systems, um, and all the education gurus coming in and lobbyists influencing lawmakers to sort of open the space of public education system to private entities. So what we now see is a heavy private investment for private individuals and corporations in the name of liberty. So and access, right? Neoliberals use the language of business and market deregulation to basically dismantle and reconstruct public schools in a corporate image, right? Um, so the language is always used to sort of fool people into thinking, well, this is what we're doing. Like the idea of charter school, all right? The model of parental education uh, is that, well, parents should take charge of the education of their kids. Actually, that's not a bad idea, but who can afford to do that? The educated middle class and upper middle class will have the tools and accessibility to bring in good faculty, spend money and have the infrastructure for providing good classrooms. And of course, corporations are too happy to come in and bring their tools and facilitate these things. And the government should subsidize that, right? Because the vouchers are issued for the charter schools. So what happens to those who don't have the tools? Those parents who have to work 2, 3, 4 jobs in order to make it, and don't have accessibility. So do they go by the wayside? Well, the answer is, yeah, no problem, right? Because everyone has access. Everyone should has equal access. And if they want to have their own charter schools, they're free to do so. But do they? That's the question. So what's happening in the university system today is an interesting phenomena. And when I say interesting, I don't mean it in a positive sense. It's kind of critical engagement with what's happening with higher ed. The universities have adopted over the years, starting with the 80s and the 90s and today, it's gone full force. The entrepreneurial model of university education, which is, again, diametrically opposed to the kind of educational model that we had post World War II in the 50s and 60s and the early 70s, where the idea was, education is for education, for people to become well-rounded citizens, not consumers of a system, but engaged citizens of any system that they could shape in a democratic society. So universities as entrepreneurial systems are such where the administration are these professionals in the fields of marketing and business management and public relations and all these things that happen at the corporate paradigm, bringing that into the university, and the university runs like a business. Essentially, what neoliberalism dictates to school systems is that you have to look at your school like a business and run it like a business. And the profitability is, you reduce attrition, you create kind of programs where accelerates graduation and get people to go out there and get jobs, right? The idea of university education, it's not about education, it's about really high level vocational training for people to go to a university and come out with a degree and have license to go and become, software programmers, engineers, and in other fields. But what about that idea of well-roundedness? The idea that you go to the university to transform into a human being that kind of has an understanding of notions of morality, notions of ethics, notions of socialization for the sake of working with your neighbors, not socializations for the sake of individual success and social Darwinistic, winning attitude and that sort of thing. So entrepreneurial model says, well, what programs make more money? What programs are private entities, pharmaceutical companies, the defense industry companies invest into those programs? So money comes into a program. STEM fields, right? Science, technology, engineering, and math. These fields are the ones that tend to get lots of money. And when they hire new faculty at these programs, essentially the president of the university is the CEO of the university. He comes or she comes and looks at the program. So, well, this program, our engineering program, is a successful program. Why? Because we have these faculty that have connections to Cisco systems or IBM and so on, and they're bringing in money. So the funding that comes in helps our school, and we're talking about public schools, that is, helps our school succeed. And we're getting all these graduates and they're all getting jobs, and that looks good for our business. So what happens with the humanities, philosophy, and the literature department? Well, the theory was that, okay, we bring all this money and these programs are well funded. And so the president should go to the program directors, the deans and the chairs and the director of various, STEM programs and say, okay, you have all this money. Let's use some of this money that you've made and give it to our philosophy department, give it to our humanities department, give it to our literature department so they could survive and sustain this robust approach to learning about the human condition, learning about the arts, which because that's important, right? Ideally, that would be the case. But first of all, the presidents who are business minded don't have that kind of state of mind. So, uh, and if they do to some extent, say, well, I want to have this, image of a university that has all kinds of disciplines offered, they go to the STEM department and say, well, okay, you should just distribute this money, some of it to them. And they say, well, why should we? We worked hard for this, right? So it becomes this competition between different departments. And of course, once you devalue the humanities, people are going to start thinking in those terms within the hierarchy of the university and say, well, these guys, they don't do anything, right? What kind of job can you get when you graduate from with a philosophy degree, right? The best thing you can do is maybe become a community college teacher, or if you're really lucky, out of 1,000 applicants, you can get one job at the university, and then everybody else, they have to go work for Starbucks or DoorDash or Uber and all the rest of it, which is actually what's happening. So this entrepreneurial model is not really panning out the way in which it was initially brought to the university systems. So public university systems in this nation, on the average, get about 12% of their budget from their respective states, right? Government, 12%. The other 88% of the budget has to come from tuition, uh, conferences that they set up using dormitories and the rooms as ballrooms and so on when school is not in session, and bring in an income, as well as the grant money that Mellon Foundation, Rockefeller Foundation, or Defense Industries, or IBM, or Oracle, or Google bring into the university. And with those come many strings. Right? This is neoliberalism in operation. The thing about neoliberalism is that you don't really see it like, okay, I can definitely define this tenant and that tenant, and this is what happens, and that is what happens. It just happens, right? It's a process. It's been gradual. Now it's rapidly taking over all the important institutions in our society and making it and shaping it in their own image. And basically people are start to think that, oh, this is ontological. I was born into this. And this must be natural, right? Just like how people respond to challenges to capitalism. Say, what other way can we have a society, right? Everything is market, right? And they think that if the market bears low wages, if the market bears long hours of work, no benefits, if the market bears the exploitation of labor, then it's okay. And it's smart business to do all of this. Robert Reich, who used to be a Secretary of Labor with Bill Clinton's administration for a couple of years, and now is a professor at UC Berkeley, wrote this book recently called The System, Who Rigged It and How We Can Fix It. And he talks about how the switch happened when neoliberalism started sort of permeating government. All right, the switch happened from with deregulation, from going from businesses, big corporations and companies, sort of offering their employees as the main assets of the company, to switching the protection of employees and the use of employees for betterment of the company, and sort of like in service to the communities in which they were doing business, switching it to business for shareholders. In other words, profits for the main shareholders. And oftentimes the shareholders, the majority shareholders, are the founders and the rich people who already have shares in other places and so on. So it's like a sort of a monopoly, a collective monopoly of the investment class, Um, so the employees become expendable and they become these resources that um, should be exploited to the maximum level that it can be done and then discarded because we will have more human resources standing around the corner. The IT industry is infamous for this because the turnover in the IT industry um, is uh, is just astonishing. You get a job, you work at a high level job, 2 years around the clock, and they just hand you a pink slip, and they bring somebody else from, say, Pakistan, who speaks English and has the qualifications that you have, and then they give him the job for half your salary. They use him for a few years and then bring somebody else. The revolving door just continues. You go to another company and they do the same thing to you, and then you start learning that, well, this is what I need to do. I need to game the system so I can survive. My family matters, and then you start competing with your neighbors, and you don't care about co-workers. So there's really no community of workers. So in this business of keeping people insecure is part of the social control of neoliberalism. There's social control, there's exploitation of human resources, and also converting education into high-level vocational training. Uh, and then the immaterial labor um, is essentially the currency of this system. It's very sophisticated. I mean, think about it. I want to say a few words about immaterial labor. I was reading an article about DoorDash that recently in California, where I live, um, in conjunction with Uber and other companies, uh, gig economy businesses. I mean, these are tech companies essentially. They don't do anything. They have these apps that allow the grocers to connect with the customers, right? And then they use human beings who they say, well, you're your own boss, contractors, right? Individuals who have a car or a bike or a motorcycle, or what have you, whichever means of a vehicle that you have to deliver goods to people's homes. And you get paid based on each gig. You have no benefits, no security job, and essentially you're a little business, and you make business decisions of, I'm going to take this one, I'm going to take that one, I lose that one, and you're constantly, in a state of anxiety uh, and not having any security at all. So they got together in California and defeated a law that was passed a couple years ago of making these gig workers into employees so they could have some measure of benefits and uh, you know uh, health insurance perhaps, vacation time, something that a normal employee in a company would have, and they used millions and millions and millions of dollars to defeat this law, and they were successful. So DoorDash, which is a $65 billion company, is now looking to expand massively, and is showing that if you beat the labor movement, then you can take control, and this is social control by these tech companies, and continue exploiting labor, and then at the same time fool people into thinking that they have freedom, right? Many of my young students, these are undergraduate students I'm talking about. Um, when I say young, I'm talking about 18 to 24. They have lots of energy, right? So they can stay up all night, many nights in a row, study, and then work around the clock, go and do this DoorDash stuff and bring some cash into their pockets, thinking that this is it. I'm my own boss. I get to control my own time and flexibility, and the stress. Sometimes it gets to them, of course, right? Especially during the pandemic, it's been kind of difficult. Uh, but then they're able to withstand the stress. But what happens when they get out of college and then they have these degrees and they're still doing DoorDash, right? What happens to the little grocery stores? Right now, they can sign up with DoorDash and pay the fees and then get to their customers. But the big ones are also there too. Safeway versus a mom and pop shop around the corner. And then DoorDash is starting to, with this success, with defeating this law, starting to look at how to expand and do the Amazon model of taking over all aspects of groceries and have their own stores, not only groceries, but kitchens, DoorDash kitchens, where through sophisticated programming with YouTube influencers and Instagram influencers and all that, promoting this idea of DoorDash kitchen, bringing celebrity chefs and give them a couple $1 million to sort of become the face of DoorDash, or other celebrities to market their idea of freedom, and how DoorDash just gives you so many choices, and you can have any kind of food, any kind of a delicacy at the tip of your fingers. All you got to do is use the app, and then these happy employees will bring stuff to you. And isn't that great? They recently, during this recent Super Bowl, they used a commercial using Sesame Street. Going back to a program about Sesame Street, how it was about promoting the local, neighborhoods, because Sesame Street is about being connected to your community, right? Exploiting Sesame Street and its embedded dearness to people, and commercializing it and bringing this person from I forget the actor's name, from Hamilton, African American with beard, very dashing, to become this person that sort of goes around the stores and shows people that all you got to do is just have a DoorDash app and use it. And then you can be with the mom and pop shops. It's as if you've gone there, and you have this connection with your community. But that's the trick, right? You think you're connected to your community, but what is the connection? um, Nobody is connected. And that's the idea behind neoliberalism. So we looked at education in prisons, and thinking that that's a good idea, uh, of course, right? Uh, but there's no national program for offering college education in prisons. Uh, if you are an inmate, depending on where you are, what state, what particular county, and so on, you can have access to getting your GED, and then thinking about having uh, an opportunity when you're out was very limited. Right? College education is limited because what happens is in prison you can get really good education because the humanities, takes over if you decide to do that. But the system wants to continue the social control because those who go against the system, any infractions, will be punished, right? So there's a punishing system. And even that is commercialized, right? The whole business of private jails, which I think that the current Biden administration is trying to put an end to it by signing this executive order about stopping the private prisons. And eventually, hopefully, we'll get to a point where we won't have any of that. But even at the public prison systems, what happens in California, for example, is that to keep an inmate fed and protected and sort of just, kept keeping locked up with all the employees, the guards, and administration, and the technology that is involved and all that, which, tech industry, benefits greatly. It costs around $50,000 a year per inmate. Now imagine if you were to transform that system into a rehabilitation system, where you look at the reasons why this person has become an inmate, why this person decided to go against the system, steal something, become violent, right? What is this response to? So to what extent do we have proper psychological services? We have an education system built into prison system where they can get a high school and college education and have access to other ways of seeing the world and gaining agency and thinking that, okay, I can go out there and have a chance and so forth. That's what needs to happen rather than punishing people and then keeping them locked up. But the neoliberal system says, well, everything is an opportunity for commodification. Right? So bring the prisoners in there. They use the services that the state requires, and then you got business, and you can collect data. Going back to the example of DoorDash, I meant to talk about this. Um, Not only uh, the grocery industry benefits from gaining, data from, who's buying what, and through this whole app system, but also the tech giants such as DoorDash and others collecting this data, and big data is um, extracted from all these transactions that happen. Uh, but the human beings are becoming isolated from one another, right? And not recognizing that what is happening. And so this all this immaterial labor of organizing and trying to do things, and then actually doing the work, right? You get paid for doing the work. Take a loaf of bread and deliver it, you get paid only for that. But for all the other things that you do, and the data that your labor produces, right, that you don't get paid for, all of that goes back into the system of the liberal uh, economy. Uh, so what are we doing with our college students? We are teaching them that, and this is highly problematic, particularly in the economic departments, teaching them that this is the future. The future is in the present. Right? The tech giants will determine what sort of infrastructure we're going to have for our nation, right? So the nation building has been left to the tech giants, and you you can still take humanities courses, but those are kind of like laundry chores that you must do. Checklist 1, 2, 3, and the truth is that out on the street, you need to have survival skills of social Darwinism, and you cannot question uh, who's up on top, right? This business of 1% and 99% uh, is just something that crazy radicals do out on the street because they want to turn this country into a socialist, kind of backwater place, and can't have that. So the system of uh, economic teaching is about teaching people how to socialize themselves into accepting what the system gives them, and recognizing that as ontological. That's just how it is. And I just need to do the best I can to become a winner in this society, right? So if becoming a shareholder is the goal, right? What do I need to do? Should I be an app builder? But what are the ethical implications of the app that I'm building? That's not part of the system, right? The ethics in economic departments, in business departments, is out the window. The ethics has to do with protection of copyright and the intellectual copyright, the product copyright, and so on. So the protection of the big boys, as it were, and not so much about what you do as implications that can cause harm to other human beings, right? Like GMO, for example, right? I have young science, very smart students that come and whenever there's discussion about GMO, they defend the business of GMO. So, well, we're going to feed the world and end world hunger by genetically modifying all these foods. And so we asked the question, well, why is it that it's banned in Europe and some other countries? Um, uh, have they done enough studies to see the ill effects of the GMOs? They've done some studies to show that, hey, this is good. Look, corn can reproduce and be a huge harvest as opposed to traditional organic farming of corn. And then we can give everybody corn. And isn't that wonderful? But what does it do? When the corn is fed to mice and the mice die after a month, that's an alarming sign. That's a red flag to have more studies on human beings and see, what happens with the GMO. And this is what the Europeans have recognized and put an end to it. But I mean, that's just one of the problems that we're facing with the education that happens in colleges and universities, and how the business departments have taken over the business of teaching ethics because they believe that, and I'm generalizing, of course, right? Not all business programs are like this, and so I don't want to vilify, folks that are honestly teaching, about markets and so forth. Um, Assuming that the market is an ethics in itself, uh, can have devastating results. And we are seeing the results with the environmental disaster that we're facing. It's the number one uh, danger that the entire humanity is facing. We will be extinct if we continue doing what we're doing right now with all this, driving and flying and various industries like the cruise industry, or all these manufacturing of goods and services that we don't really need, but we are taught to think that we do. And it's all of that is reinforced through entertainment media, through news media, and all the rest of it that is corporate based. If you continue doing that, we'll be gone, say 50 years, 60 years. We'll have to live underground and so on. So uh, we need to start rethinking um, our systems. We need to start thinking about what can we do about neoliberalism? What can we do about turning the tables on it, right? Raising the minimum wage, excellent idea. Um, uh, Boosting the power of unions, excellent idea. Labor movements need to come in solidarity with the identity politic movements, right? Civil rights movements such as Black Lives Matter and the LGBTQ rights and so on, they recognize that all of this is intersectional with race and class are intersectional, and recognize that we need to build solidarity to become a force equal to the force of large corporations. Then collusions can happen, and the synthesis uh, could possibly be a society and multitude of societies that are good for humanity. Right? So with that, I'll end the lecture, and I look forward to talking with you about these ideas in person.